Hi guys, today we're going to be going over the theory and critiques of a debate round. Okay, so a quick little disclaimer at the beginning is that a lot of the sources that I've used will be listed up here in the beginning. You can feel free to ask us access to the PPT. We've linked it below in like the description below. But also kind of like a disclaimer is that like this is a very brief kind of like overview of like what critiques and what theory is, and it doesn't really go in depth. But if you are interested in going in depth, there's a lot of like resources via Reddit, Discords, but also just a bunch of like the website that I have listed below. Okay, awesome. So let's first understand what exactly is theory. So very simply put, theory is just an argument about how we should debate. So instead of arguing about the content like within the actual debate, it puts an emphasis on like the how the debate round is insinuated and how that specific norm or practice needs to be kind of like argued for. So it's usually included as a short snippet at the top of your case or just top of the initial case after any opponent violates something specific. But a really important key aspect of theory is that even though you read the theory argument at the top, you still want to include the rest of your actual case to promote the education of an actual debate round. You can collapse on theory later on and argue that it's more important than the content, but also it's important to remember to just include it there just in case. Okay, so there's kind of like two ways you can structure theory. The first way you can structure it is super simple. It's like a little paragraph or like a snippet. So essentially what happens is you summarize the theory into very few sentences to make the same theory argument without the formal structure. So it works for like strategic like lay rounds and it also saves you a lot of time. For example, if they're paraphrasing their evidence, instead of reading a whole paraphrasing theory shell on them, all you say is start with an overview. They must represent X evidence, which is that even if you buy their case, you can't vote for it because you don't know it's true. You're not exactly doing a full rounded out structure there, but you're still having a very simple reason of why you shouldn't vote for them because they're paraphrasing and it's a bad norm. A more like kind of like theory shell of it is a second type of structure. It's when you include the A, B, C, D factor, like all these individual components. So the first part of the components is just A, which is the interpretation. So this is a specific rule or norm that the team reading the theory thinks that the other team should have followed. And B is just like the violation. For example, like, yeah, they failed to meet this interp. Here, you could include a screenshot if you're debating digitally, or just like confirm this in Crossfire about what specifically happened. The C part is just like the standards. So this is really important. This is the reason why your interpretation is good for debate. And you often want to link it back to like fairness, education, or some sort of like safety impact. Because your whole purpose of arguing about theory is about that norm of the debate. So you want to make sure that like debate is like fair and educational. And you should also try to follow like the claim, warrant, impact, and have kind of like that structure because this is kind of like a main argument that you're making within the shell. D is about the voters. So this is just really like kind of doing a little bit of weighing and explaining why the fairness and education and safety aspects come before the content of debate. For example, I would just say like, yeah, you voting the voters for this is like on fairness because it's impossible to have like debate rounds function as normal if you don't have both sides being equitable. So that's kind of like a really rundown of what a theory shell is. Here's what would it actually look like if we fill all these like A slots for a paraphrasing theory. So, an interpretation about a paraphrasing like theory shell would just be that debaters must use direct quotes when introducing evidence for the first time. To clarify, don't paraphrase. So that's super simple, and that's the standard that you should have between debates. The violation is like saying, oh, the case that they sent in the email chain is paraphrased. Maybe I'll include a screenshot to show, or maybe I'll just like confirm it in Crossfire. But there is a violation right there. And then C, which is the standards. I would argue that paraphrasing incentivizes teams to spin evidence that gives them a strategic advantage to win and forces teams to debate arguments without true warrants. D, which is the voters. This ties that argument back and explains that it's really important for fairness in education. So, for example, like debate is a competition, and if it isn't fair, no one participates. So that's why you should vote against them because paraphrasing is bad. It also links back to education because no one's going to learn from debate if the information that's presented is inaccurate. So this is also kind of like an example of like just essentially like how it would look like. So let's talk a little bit more about like kind of like in like a little bit more go into the weeds about like theory. So you kind of have different types the way you can run it. You can run it as drop the debater versus dropping the argument. So you need to specify if the implication of that theory shell is to vote down the other team or just to take the argument off the flow. So dropping the debater. This is going to be the most common one seen in PF rounds because you're kind of arguing that voting them down incentivizes them to not do it again, and that's good for the debate of the norm space. So, but dropping the argument is a little bit different because it happens more in LDM policy when a debater is specifically reading theory about a type of argument. For example, if you watched a previous lecture about like conditionality, that one you can run dropping the argument because it's not about like voting against them just because like, like they're doing something, but it's more of like, oh, you don't allow them to run all five different counter plans at the same time because it's unfair. So that's the differentiation that you can make. Okay, awesome. The next thing is just about reverse voting issues. So most teams introduce their theory shell by also including no RVIs. And also don't feel worried about if you feel like the structure of it is super weird. We do have a next slide later that fully goes in depth of how you can tie everything together. But in short, RVIs are just like warrants to why the opposing team shouldn't win the round just because they prove that they're fair. So this also is usually included in the shell and just have a little line on the underview where it just explains like, no, RBIs, that's not fair. They don't win to win because they proved they were. However, the other team could also like equally come up and explain and read reasons why winning the shell means that they should win. So this is when an actual reverse voting issue is presented. So they're presented as they can win the theory because of the time skewed answer. They can extrapolate about how it's important, like how they shouldn't win because they use their time to respond to the theory. But they can also win under an RVI by saying like a counter interp. So a counter interp is basically the same thing as like the regular shell, but it's giving a different interpretation. For example, if you have like paraphrasing, they can make a counter interp that says like, oh, paraphrasing is okay as long as it's like you're inserting words or not like excluding words or something super specific that could be counted as a reverse voting issue. And or you can just they can also just make the argument that like, oh, them not doing something is the better norm for the debate space and try to like win off of that. So these responses are not that much different than regular rebuttals you give, but just super specific in the presence of like a theory shell. Okay, so there's two main ways that like theory can play out. The first one is like reasonability. So reasonability is super simple. It's just explain to the judge like, hey, don't vote for them. Their argument, their theory is unreasonable, and just explaining how it's like a overall a bad shell and also a time skew. Because it takes a lot of time to respond to a theory, that means you're less likely to actually get to the education and fairness of time about it because it's really difficult. So that's like the first way you can play out. The second way is when you also bring a competing interpretation. So that means you're and like when they're reading their theory shell, you're also reading a theory shell on your side. So some teams could read warrants to like why the debate should have competing interps within their original shell and require the other team to have a counter interp already prepared. So that could be something that the opposing team already does and kind of requires. But in simple, a counter interp is like essentially the same thing as a regular shell, but it just specifies on how like you still include a counter interp, how you meet the counter interp, and how the counter interp standards. The voters, you can often cross-apply the opponent's voters, but you kind of just go back and explaining on like how you're able to also lead the axis of impacts of like fairness and education. And also really understand that like competing interps is an RVI, which is a reverse voting issue, because you're essentially giving a different reason for the judge to vote for you. Also, as you can see, I literally can't spell at all in any of these slides, but don't worry, we're gonna get through this together. Okay, so the first, another example of just kind of like a common theory is a trigger warning shell. So here's an actual example of how it looks. So here on the top, you have like an interpretation where they explain like, oh, before starting a speech, debaters must, exclude these aspects of like potential triggering subjects. And violation would be like, oh, they didn't. And you would specify in their contention three, they explain about this and they went into really graphic description of something that's very triggering. Then you would say a standards where it's like safety. There's like the evidence from Innocent Lives Foundation explaining how trigger warnings are super important. And then specifically leading it back again to education and fairness. So standards and then voters. Super simple. The shell's all the way on the left. But the reason what you see here with the underview, that's just kind of explaining how you should like drop the debater and you prefer competing interpretations and also saying that there's no reverse voting issues. So these things aren't exactly included in the shell, but it is kind of like important things that prepare you for the rest of the round because you're specifying like why they should be dropped because they shouldn't be doing this. They shouldn't be running triggering things without doing a proper trigger warning. and also explaining like why you should prefer competing interpretations because they can't reason their way out of it. And this is just a really common theory argument. You can just avoid this by reading like trigger warnings at the beginning or like adapting cases before. Okay, next thing is a more common theory as well. It's the topicality T-shell. So again, you see the same thing where interp at the top explaining how like they must defend the NSA resolution, how they don't defend it, and then standards about like time limits, strategic skews, and how it's overall unfair for the opponent to like debate something. This is actually really helpful for later on in the rounds because you find that topicality isn't just limited to like opponents running weird arguments, but it also comes to importance when we end up learning about critiques. Awesome. Again, you have like voters with the fairness, they kind of cite some sort of evidence and explaining independently similar things as they do the voters. They have independently about voters, competing interps, no RVIs, draw the debater. You see a lot of these common things being reiterated again just because it's really important underviews to include within when you're running a T-shell. And also really quickly, just that no, that topicality is a really common theory argument. So if you are running something that's a little bit more kind of outside the scope, you definitely do want to find evidence. The most common ways to respond to topicality is just explaining how you do fit in with the definition of the debate, which is like super simple. It's like any other argument, you're just refuting the same thing. But if you want to know more, the debate guru really posted a bunch of like reasons why on like the different types of way you can respond to topicality. And also, if you're running like a critique yourself, you probably should already have prepped on like why you should be winning in a topicality debate as well. Okay, last couple of notes. Honestly, you just gotta treat theory as a regular argument. You're still debating. The only thing that changes is just the arguments being the standards in the shell, and your refutations and kind of like defense being about like the standards, which is like, or about the voters, which is about like the fairness and education. The most important part about theory rounds is the weighing, because impacts on both sides are going to be roughly the same. You guys are both probably going to agree that like fairness and education is super important. So you need to compare the strengths of links and look at the scope. The strength of link is honestly just like who does it better? Who does it better when it comes to achieving education or fairness? And that's kind of like the debate that you're having is about like which one has a better warrant and evidence for that. The scope is just like who gets to be impacted. I think that's honestly really important to evaluate because, for example, like a lot of the times, like in a theory round, the scope might not be very large. Like you might have like you have to like do some kind of like argumentation on like who is actually able to learn and educate from this norm. Like how maybe if it's a final round, you might be able to explain like, oh, like this norm sets a really big precedence for like how debate is structured and like later on following. So like that scope aspect and that analysis is super important. But also, I just want to reiterate, like the purpose of theory is to not win rounds, but to like kind of like deter bad norms in the debate space. So learning how to run theory properly is just kind of like helpful in terms of like ensuring like bad norms aren't being processed. And in the idea, like it shouldn't be like specifically like only win rounds, but it does have the emphasis on education and fairness. So for example, like sometimes like if they concede the theory and you're like you both teams understand like a violation has been occurred, they can just like they can resolve it without having it need to be a full out theory shell round. They can like the other team can just like apologize and like do something that leads the round going back to about like the substance of the debate. So like a T shell, like it doesn't always have to be a T shell against a T shell. Sometimes it could just lead being back to like both teams agreeing and then like shifting away their both people's perspectives and going back to the debate and substance. For example, one run that I had, like my opponents were spreading, and I didn't really run an anti-spreading theory. I just was like, guys, chill, like we should not spread. Like it was a really trad round. It was a parent judge too. And then they were like, they conceded that, and then we ended up like both going back to substance instead. Okay. All right. So what are critiques? So critiques is a little bit different than theory, but also there are some similar aspects of it. But in general, critiques are just making the argument based off of the other team's assumption, language, mindset, or action in their arguments. So you're essentially, there's two types of case. You can like challenge your argument by like based off the resolution, or you can also be based off the action of the team, or you can also, we'll actually get into this later about a different type of critique that is kind of like non-linear with what the actions of anyone doing anything. So Really quick disclaimer, this is also going to be a more briefer intro and critiques, just because I don't have the most experience in this, but I will try my best to explain and give you the best analysis that I can. So here's the structure of a critique. You'll find that it's also very similar to the structure of a theory. But the first part is just like link, so like how your opponents are linked into violating the critique. The second part is just like the impact. So this explains like why their violation is bad for the world. It's also similar to like the regular case impacts. The alternative is kind of like what you're presenting about how your critique against their contention seems to resolve their kind of like their problematic system. So you can do this like with counterplan, but if you're doing PF, obviously you can't get a counterplan. You could just be like reject the AF. Rejection of the AF is important. That could lead to like a communist revolution and deter a CAP-K. You might have totally no idea what I just said about that, but don't worry, we'll get into that and we'll explain an example of that happening. The role of the ballot is just kind of like the framing argument that establishes like the importance of this border in the debate space. It could be at the end or the beginning where you can talk about like the framing of the debate and like thinking about it as a framework. But it's essentially just saying like, oh, like in a debate space, it's really important for us to like evaluate these like such values and go deep into these explanations. That's why the role of the ballot should be about the education of knowing these philosophical ideas. That could be a really simple structure of the critique. Okay, so here's what I was talking about earlier about like the communist revolution. So this is just like an example of a very stock capitalism critique. It's also like the structure of it, an actual case that you presented with a capitalism critique, probably needs a lot more evidence and like substance. But here's a very simple example of the structure. So the first one is like, oh yeah, my opponents assume that their capitalism is good and their condition one of business loans and the response on our case. This is wrong because capitalism causes overconsumption, leads to environmental destruction and human extinction, and it also treats people as tools, as the economy, and not actual lives. That already talks about like why they link in and at the top part, and also exactly like what the violation is, like what the impact of it is. And then I would say reject capitalism. So that's the alternative. The alternative is to embrace socialist movements to create change. And towards the end, you have the role of ballot where you explain we have a moral burden to reject capitalism because it results in material harm and debate. And since debate is like an educational space, we have to question these values and be able to understand these moral imperatives. That is a super like laid back example of what an overview of a stock capitalism case. But also understand that like it isn't just limited to, like stock or like commonly ran case. There's also a lot of different types. So we already talked about like how the commonly ran case about like how capitalism is bad, but also there's like arguments about like how human beings as the only moral actors is bad, and also like securitization. So there's like the really commonly ran case that you should probably have a good idea or analysis on as we approach like more in-depth like resolutions. But high level Ks, so high level Ks are just like really complex theories. It's a kind of like an LD jargon, but you probably won't hit this in PF just because most teams take a really long time to properly understand it because of the very like in-depth and complex philosophical. That's like a Baudrillard. So that's a really high level type of K where like it takes a long time for them to analyze and most people won't run it. But it also is helpful to have like a simple analysis of like how these cases are run. The next type is identity. So identity are just like arguments with top heavy like framing arguments about like the survival strategies of specific identity groups. Like for example, a lot of them is like queer pessimism, like Afro pessimism, and it's just like specific about like identity politics and how like they're important in the debate space. So some of these arguments should not be run if you don't identify within them. Like if you're not part of the group, like it's people will run theory against you on why you shouldn't be arguing about this. But a little bit more separate type of K is these are what we call KAFs or like performance Ks. So these are critiques that don't link to the opponent and could be read anywhere. So for example, at the beginning, I explained, oh, there's like two types of Ks that you make in response to something. These critiques don't have to be made in response to anything. The main purpose of these critiques is to like create overall like performances, narratives, and solvencies that argue for like you should give them the ballots because they're advocating against the oppression of a specific group. Like and they could do that like through singing or like through like music or like they're taking a narrative based stance throughout their case. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. But here's how you kind of respond to critiques. So the first part is just framework. just read an argument on just find a reason why their argument is outweighed and why you should like adopt a different framework. Because when you have a lot of like, for example, like a lot of the identity and chaos and some also other types of like Ks have like very like importance and emphasis on framing, specifically responding to why the framework should be another thing kind of excludes them from being done. But also you can perm it. So yeah, like you're not perming your hair, but you can perm an argument. Because instead of like doing that, okay, yeah, no one laughed at that. But like perms just argue that we can just do both the alternative and also vote for the team. So you just want to make the analysis like these two things are not separate. You can do both. But the different thing is attack. Okay, so you can also attack the link or violation. So, for example, in a proper critique, they explain to you on how why your contention links back to like for example, if I'm running a cap K, I'll explain how your contention links back to like supporting capitalism. You can just make analysis and refute it at that level by explaining how your contention does not lead into capitalism or how your contention doesn't lead into their critique. But that's also it. That's like analysis that you normally make through the round. But apart from that, you can just run a counter K too. So a counter K is by challenging the assumption that they or their cards make. Like for example, when you read a lot of like cap Ks, like there are a lot of like indicts on like if they read a certain evidence on how like that author is like really like pretty racist or like there's a lot of like bad cards in general, you can make the argument by challenging their evidence or like their cards that they're making it during round. Because not all Ks are good. Some Ks don't have like proper like sustenance or substance behind them, and you can just like make that argument against them. Apart from critiques, apart from doing a counter K, you can also just do a theory. So a theory is just really simply explaining about like why their method of running a K is a bad norm in debate. For example, like public forum, like the name public, you're trying to make this accessible for debate. Running like a K is inaccessible and marginalize certain groups. There's a whole argument you can make against that, and you can do that in like the form of a theory where you have an interp, violation, standards, and voters. But the next part is just like defend against the alternative. So this is also going to be like the weakest part of the argument. Like for example, let's go back to our cap K example, right? So you can just make the analysis like on probability. Like it's not likely that voting for their team will create a communist revolution. In fact, you can maybe link into your own case and explain how like you're able to solve their alternative better in your world because their ultimate impact about their alternative is separate. And you can make the analysis on why your side is actually able to better solve for their alternative than what's being presented. Okay, so a couple of key pointers of a critique round. Number one, don't concede the role of the ballot. So instead of saying that like, oh, we should prioritize, like they're probably gonna say something about like prioritizing a specific part of like education and fairness and debate, you probably want to like not saying those two things are important, like they're obviously really important, but you're just arguing for a different type of the role of the ballot. Maybe the role of ballot isn't specifically to argue about like their specific performance K. It should be arguing and specifying why it's important for education to be accessible. So like that's just an example of like arguing for a different role of the ballot. But you can also just like generate offense by running something else. So that just means like you can run theory, you can run turns, you can run a counter K, all these previous examples, that makes you win the round because you're kind of like building up your offensive against why you shouldn't like why the opposing team should lose the round just because their K is bad. But moreover, I think like the strongest part and like the most simplest way to just like win a K round is just a link in because sometimes you can cross apply your own case. Like for example, like it's probably easier for like the socialist revolution on the AF than neg if you can explain on why you're able to solve the alternative anyway. Because a lot of the times, like all these impacts, they're not that great and they use a lot of like older cards. You can make your own analysis on why you're able to win the round even underneath their like critique analysis. Okay, thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate all the support. Really appreciate Slides Go, my goat, and hopefully you can watch the rest of the videos as well.